Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. In this reflection, we continue with the 46th ayat of Surah Al-Anfal in the shade of the Quran. Here, when we look at the command of the ayat to obey Allah and obey His Messenger, we indicated to the reality that knowledge is a prerequisite of obedience. And we learn from the ulama of usul al-fiqh that to implement a ruling in the Sharia, two conditions are required. One is knowledge and the second is ability. The second is ability, knowledge and ability. So, by implication, when we consider the fact that the deen speaks to the whole of the human being, we have to ask, what are some of those things which create obstacles in our practice of the deen? If a ruling in the Sharia is brought about or implemented by the realization of two conditions, knowledge and capacity, then when we lack in bringing about or practicing a particular command of the Sharia, we have to look at the knowledge feature and we have to look at the capacity feature. At times we may be ignorant, and at times we may be knowledgeable. At times we may have the internal wherewithal to combat the shaitan within us, and at other times we find ourselves being obedient to our desires and to shaitan. So then, two realities are before us, realities that we find in Ramadan, realities that are communicated, or we should say qualities. In Ramadan, we learn about the centrality of learning in practice. And we learn in Ramadan about the focus of the believers on their relationship with Allah wa ta'ala. And that relationship is manifested in two activities: the recitation of the Quran and the engaging in Salah. So that the fasting is a vehicle by which we are able to control ourselves and free ourselves from those distractions which prevent us from these two activities just mentioned, the reciting of the Quran and the Salah. Because of the fact that we detach from engaging in activities which would otherwise be permissible in the month of Ramadan, we learn how to focus. In the month of Ramadan, during the day, we're prohibited from bad character, and we're prohibited, more specifically, from the intimate act, which is partly characteristic of marital relationship. And we also are prohibited from eating. Because of the reward that's associated with good deeds during this time, we've become focused more on trying to realize the great pleasure of Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala. We're trying to achieve the pleasure of Allah by increasing in good deeds. So then our whole life becomes one which is oriented toward Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala, and our activities are measured. So then the increase of Iman which we experience is by increase of good deeds. And the increase of good deeds come from doing without or not doing. Some of the ulama characterize fasting as not doing non-performance. We're not performing certain activities. And in that not doing of certain actions, we find ourselves increasing in iman. So obedience to Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala requires that sort of spiritual formation, one in which we become oriented in the proper manner towards Al-Mawla Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, towards Allah, in such a way that we can focus on increasing iman. And when iman is increased, we have to again turn to the lessons of Ramadan, how we're encouraged to give in charity and be patient with one another. This is why the school of Ramadan serves as a spiritual retreat which is transformative. Because in this time period, as a community, we find ourselves cooperating in that which is good and being patient with one another. And in that, at least in principle, there is some unity. When business is conducted as usual, the lessons of Ramadan tend to dissipate. In practice, we find that they may even be absent. Or we find that we return to a condition that may have been worse, na'udhu billah. Because the lifestyle that we live at times is not one which safeguards the values of iman within our lives, we find ourselves engaging in activities which undermine our very identity as Muslims. And our identity is rooted in La ilaha illallah. Our identity is rooted in Muhammad Rasulullah. So the Shahadatan is the guiding point to that reality. So implicit in confessing our belief in Allah and in His Messenger is obedience. So then Surah Al-Anfal, in particular Ayat 46, is teaching us in the beginning of the ayat that there is a command to obedience, and in the end of the ayat there's a command to sabr. So obedience is not easy. Obedience is not easy for the person who has not reached the stage of a nafs al-mutma'inna, the stage of the self that's tranquil and at peace, right, with following the command of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. So when we're in the stage of a nafs al-lawama, the blaming self, we're in the state of mujahada. So sometimes in that state of mujahada, which is a spiritual training of the self, right? In some cases, there's a spiritual combat with the self. Sometimes we win, sometimes we lose, right? Sometimes we win, sometimes we lose. From the mercy of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, then, is this understanding, right, that when there's incongruence between our commitment to La ilaha illallah wa Muhammadur Rasulullah in our practice, right, the shahada, the testimony, the understanding, the what, the affirmation with certainty, when the fruit of that affirmation, when the fruit is not there, there's an incongruence, right? Basically, when we're not practicing, put it simply, put it simply. So, of course, then, there will be differing with ourselves and with others, right? The first level of unity is unity within the self. When the self is at odds, right, there's discontentment, and that discontentment will manifest itself when the self, right, has no center, right. How can you deal with people, right? How can you deal with people? That center has to be the shahadatan, that reaffirmation of the reality of Allah and our purpose in life, right? So when we're focused and we have a sense of direction, it's easier to deal with the ins and outs of people because you're content with the will of Allah, right? That comes back down to the issue of qadr, and it comes back down to the issue of the irada of Allah, the will of Allah, right? And the will of Allah is two: one as manifest in the universe, and one as manifest in the Sharia. And there's details to that, right? But the reality of the Sharia is either we do or don't do, right? We do or don't do. So that's the question that's before us. When life presents us, right? And this is from the qadr of Allah with certain challenges. How is it that we respond? Sometimes we lose, sometimes we don't, right? And that losing and gain has to do with proximity to Allah, right? And gaining, are we gaining in proximity to Allah? Or are we distancing ourselves from the will of Allah? From the will of Allah. So unity then has to come in our commitment to Iman. Right, and that's the first. Unity has to come in our commitment to Iman. And without that commitment, unity is impossible, because the self will never be directed to that which is good in the real sense. And remember that the qadr of Allah, part of it is bitterness, or khayrihi wa sharrihi, right? And sweetness, bitterness and sweetness, and good and evil, right? So Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala only wants good for the believers, even if at times that good may seem bitter. Sometimes that good will be sweet. But for those who disobey Allah, what's left is evil. And sometimes that evil will be sweet, and sometimes it will be bitter, right? So everything that takes place in the universe then, right, falls within the reality of the irada of Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala, right? The will of Allah. And the will of Allah is expressed in the reality of life itself, and also within the Sharia itself. And that needs more detail. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر لي ولكم والحمد لله رب العالمين.